Okay, today we are going to study, think about poetry and metaphor. Without metaphor, our life will be what? Barren, right? According to Milan Kundera, metaphors are dangerous. Metaphors are dangerous. So metaphors are not to be trifled with. You must not play with it because it's dangerous. According to Aristotle, metaphor is the one thing that cannot be learned from others. It is also a sign of genius, since a good metaphor implies an eye for resemblance. What do you think? What do you think of this metaphor? What is it? We are going to read an essay, long essay, more than 30 pages long. Imagination as a poetic process in Yeats, Heaney, and other poets. Last Monday, we read a poem by Yeats, Beggar to Beggar, Cried. And we are going to read an analysis of the poem in my essay. And next Monday, we are going to read another poem by Seamus Heaney. Seamus Heaney he died last August, and he is one of the best poets. I wrote 2 poems for him, and one poem, I showed it to him. Is it a poem dedicated to him? And he liked it, right? That was last August, I think. And I did another poem, and it's published in the journal, a Yeats journal. And the journal will be out in a few days. So why don't we go to the essay now? In literature, form and content are 2 important elements. How to use language is related to form, whereas what to contain in it is the question of content. Whether these 2 elements are one and the same has long been a controversial question and still remained a central issue of literary criticism. It is often said there are 2 kinds of use in language. To me, the problem has begun to rise from this thought on the use of language, that is, the daily use of language and the literary use of language. One of the questions that I will deal with in the paper is it possible to dichotomize the use of language? Language is used to convey thoughts and ideas to other persons. For the purpose of this, facts and imagination are engaged. If facts are objectively utilized to convey a thought, we seem to consider it practical or literal use of language. But if we maneuver a lot of imagination to convey an image to an individual, we tend to call it the poetic use of language. But in fact, the dichotomy is true only in part. How to realize imagination is a key question in literature. As time proceeds, literature changes. Changes in literature have depended on how imagination being realized in each of the specific period of time. Just as we cannot see air, we cannot see imagination. And we hardly think about it as a thing we take for granted always, but to understand poetry, we have to think. One important thing to see imagination work is rely on metaphors. For metaphors are one of the most typical actualizations poetic process of imagination. The more imaginative the poet is, the more and the better metaphors. Yeats is faithful to a tradition and has transcended the anxiety of inference to become the representative poet of our century. How he has become such a great poet will be observed from the perspective of imagination, the workings of his imagination, mainly through the medium of poetic metaphors in his poetry. In this analysis, he'll be compared with other poets in different periods. At the same time, I will make an attempt to compare and contrast one of the finest poets in our time, Seamus Heaney, alongside Yeats. By so doing, I could possibly draw diverging facets of modern and contemporary sensibility, or diverging poetic processes of two great poets in our time. There may be a lot of ways to deal with the question of imagination in literary works, but in this paper, I will tackle this problem mainly from the standpoint of metaphor, how the metaphor works as a cell of imagination in poetry. Because the metaphor is one of the most salient characteristics in poetry, though it is often observed in fields other than literature, the use of metaphor itself will be analyzed and classified. Mixed metaphor, extended metaphor, implied metaphor, and the workings of metaphor. Little comparisons and the metaphoric comparisons. The important scholar that deals with that is John R. Searle. The discussion will also include the distinction between fancy and imagination, and the relation between imagination and symbolism and allegory, as explained by Coleridge, Yeats, Sir Synge, and other poets, and critics including Richards. Centering on the problem of imagination metaphor in poetry, the paper also deliberates how it relates to simile, metonym, irony, and so forth, as well as how it differs from an image. The paper will be both theoretical and analytical. In the analysis, evidence will be sampled both from the poets and their works, and from philosophical and critical essays as well. What is imagination? To make a fine definition is important, but still more important, we hear it straight from the horse's mouth. That is from the poets, writers directly. Poets, playwrights, novelists in general make use of imagination in their work without making conscious effort as we breathe air. To hear from them, including Yeats and Heaney, may keep us from leaving the track. In the preface to his play, The Play of the Western World, Synge writes, we have dealt with Synge, right, earlier in this semester. I'm glad to acknowledge this is what Synge said, his introduction to his play. I'm glad to acknowledge how much I owe to the folk imagination of these fine people, Aran Islands and other, right? Anyone who has lived in real intimacy with the Irish peasantry will know that the wildest sayings and ideas in this play are tame indeed, compared with the fancies one may hear in any little hillside cabin in Gisala or Karoro or Dingle Bay. All art is a collaboration. And there is little doubt that in the happy ages of literature, striking and beautiful phrases are as ready to the storyteller's or the playwright's hand as the rich cloaks and dresses of his time. It is probable when the Elizabethan dramatist took his inkhorn and sat down to his work, he used many phrases that he had just heard as he sat at dinner from his mother or his children. In Ireland, those of us who know the people have the same privilege. When I was writing The Shadow of Glen, some years ago, I got more aid than any learning could have given me from a chink in the floor of the old Wicklow house where I was staying. That let me hear what was being said by the servant girls in the kitchen. This matter, I think, is of importance. For in countries where the imagination of the people and the language they use is rich and living, it is possible for a writer to be rich and copious in his words, and at the same time to give the reality, which is the root of all poetry, in a comprehensive and natural form. So why don't we have a rich literature? We do have, but what we don't have is what? Good translations. Good translations, right? So in the near future, we'll have a Nobel Prize winner from Korea, I hope. In modern literature of towns, however, richness is found only in sonnets or prose poems or in one or two elaborate books that are far away from the profound and common interests of life. One has, on one side, Mallarmé, Huysmans, producing his literature, and on the other, Ibsen and Zola, dealing with the reality of life in Zola's and pallid words. In Ireland, for a few years more, we have a popular imagination that is fiery and magnificent, tender. It's surprising. Ireland is such a small country, but they already have 5 Nobel Literature winners. Great. We got none. And China, the huge country, just had another Nobel Prize winner, too. Great, right? So that those of us who wish to write start with a chance that is not given to writers in places where the springtime of the local life has been forgotten, and the harvest is memory only, and the straw has been turned into bricks. This is what Synge wrote in January 21st, 1907, for an introduction to his play, The Playboy of the Western World. I find this a profound poetics of his, which deserves a close study. He does not try to ask any question. For instance, what is imagination? What is poetic language? What is representation? For whom literature is written? What is metaphor? What kind of poetry is good? And so forth. But to these questions, I can infer all the answers from what Synge has said in his preface. I'd like to tackle these questions broadly by appreciating what Synge has in mind in the preface, and then proceed to a few romantics that might have some bearing on the poetry of Yeats and possibly of Shemasini. The key words in the preface of the Playboy are folk imagination, the Irish peasantry, the wildest sayings and ideas, the fancies we may hear, striking and beautiful phrases, what was being said by the servant girls in the kitchen, the imagination of people in a comprehensive and natural form, a popular imagination that is fiery and magnificent and tender, and so forth. To Synge, the language as spoken by the common people of the country is a language that is full of joy and reality. It is fiery, magnificent, and tender because they are the people who have a popular imagination. The fancies that one may hear in the kitchen may be some words with profound poetic and metaphoric import. That is, they must be metaphors, or at least many of them must be. Synge cites an example from the Elizabethan period, the Elizabethan dramatist. The dramatist must refer to the Elizabethan poets and dramatists, including William Shakespeare. Probably, Elizabethan literature is the most imaginative with richest metaphors. To cite Shakespeare will suffice. According to a recent publication, Metaphors Dictionary by Alice Summer and Doris Weiss, of 6,500 comparative metaphoric entries, more than 12%, or about 800 entries are Shakespearean metaphors. Great, right? So to have a metaphor is what? Genius, right? The book covers Plato to Bill Clinton, the US president. Bill Clinton is a very good speaker, right? The second important thing that I could observe from the preface above is that metaphors are deeply rooted in the common people. What we speak is metaphors. Metaphor is not the thing that is unique in poetry, but it is ingrained in the language people speak and write every day. Certainly, it is wrong to think that metaphor is only for poetry, not for practical language. But it seems that the more you are imaginative and poetically gifted, the more metaphors you can use. Poets as well as politicians who use more metaphors, according to the number of metaphors entries in the book, Metaphors Dictionary, prove that they have made greater contribution to their field than those who make roughly less use of metaphors. But you have to use metaphors wisely. It's dangerous, right? If it's used by Hitler, it becomes a weapon, right? All right, okay. In this section, I will attempt to make a definition of the key term, imagination, which is closely related to how the metaphor works, and shown in various places in the work of some poets and critics who may have some bearing on Jason Heaney and make comparison between them, this may lead to some firm grasp of imagination. It will not be satisfying to define imagination merely by going to critics or even by going to the horse's mouth, because a certain working of a certain metaphor in a poem cannot be reduced to a definition. A metaphor in a good poem requires a fine eye to tell the fine nuance in it. The poets to be reviewed are Coleridge, Wordsworth, Shelley, Yeats, and Heaney, and the critics I go to are Richards, Johnson, and others. Particularly, William Shakespeare is one of the best critics. For as far as metaphors are concerned, he is, I think, the master of metaphors. I attempt to jump into the deep sea of his metaphors to recover the pearls. When Coleridge is mentioned, my mind instantly links him to an organic metaphor, the synthesizing of disparate things. T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland could be the instance of this Poetic, which is, I think, according to Richard's interpretation of the same organic theory, a type of fancy in the structure of imagination. And the distinction between fancy and imagination. One of the best critics for Coleridge is Richards, though Richard says, I'm not, in what follows, very concerned to present Coleridge's theory in the exact form in which he built it. When he begins his book, Coleridge on imagination, but when I finished reading his chapter, Imagination Fancy, I feel that Richard's explanation on the terms, imagination, fancy and imagination is the same as Coleridge, seems to have intended to define, though his chapter deepens Coleridge's definition, and though he sometimes puts his foot into his mouth in the chapter. One place in the same chapter, Richard contrasts fancy and imagination. Interestingly, by saying that the contrast might be illustrated equally with whole works. Thus, in prose fiction, the detective novel is a type of fancy, but any presentation of integral view of life will take the structure of imagination. The units imaginatively disposed may themselves be products of fancy. And conversely, a series of imaginative passages may be arranged as bees on a string in the mode of fancy, a structure characteristic of Hardy. The passage quoted above is worth the further examination here. Richard seems to be careful not to use the term structure when he talks about fancy, whereas imagination has the privilege of being labeled as structure. That is to say, he agrees with Coleridge that imagination is a poetics of organicism, and that fancy is a result that is yoked together by the poet by means of some accidental coincidence. So far, so good. But according to Richards, the detective novel is fancy in the structure of imagination. Where in Hardy, imagination takes the mode of fancy as bees on a string. What I disagree with Richard about is this. In essence, Coleridge's distinction between fancy and imagination is worthwhile when we study a poem or novel in detail. However, when the distinction is extended and is applied to a whole work, as Richard does here, all the whole poems and novels plays are to be either fancy or imagination in the form of imagination or fancy. The final judgment of the whole work is, I think, to be based on how well it is imaginatively organic as a whole, how moving, how pleasurable, how beautiful, and so forth. The elements of fancy and imagination play their respective roles. Their roles cannot be swapped because it may do this poem's proper poetic effect harm. In the specific structure of a poem, namely in the lines or in the stanzas, helping build a whole imaginative structure. And then we have a whole book, an imaginative work, whether it is a detective novel or Hardy. And the question is how good or bad it is as an imaginative whole. To get a firmer grasp of what Coleridge means by fancy imagination, I will go back to his famous distinction that appears at the end of the first volume of his Biographia Literaria, end quote. The imagination, then, I consider either as primary or secondary. The primary imagination I hold to be the living power and prime agent of all human perception, and as a repetition in the finite mind of the eternal act of creation in the finite I am. The second ray I consider as an echo of the former, coexisting with the conscious will, yet still as identical with the primary in the kind of its agency and differing only in degree and in the mode of its operation. It dissolves, diffuses, it dissipates in order to recreate. Or where this process is rendered impossible, yet still, at all events, it struggles to idealize and to unify. It is essentially vital. Even all objects, as objects, are essentially fixed and dead. Fancy, on the other hand, has no other counters to play with but fixities and definite. The fancy is intended, indeed, no other than a mode of memory, emancipated from the order of time and space and blended with and modified by that empirical phenomenon of the will, which is expressed by the word choice. But equally, with the ordinary memory, it must receive all this material, ready-made from the law of association. The definition of imagination fancy made by Coleridge are indeed wonderful, and since he published his Biographia in 1817, poets and critics have furthered the definition of imagination. Now, let me go to other poets such as Yeats, Wallace Stevens, Seamus Heaney. The imagination expounded by Yeats in his symbolism painting and the symbolism poetry has some bearing on Coleridge's, even though Coleridge is never mentioned in both essays. Yeats makes a distinction between symbol and allegory in symbolism in painting. He says that people in England dislike an art if they are told it is symbolic. For they confuse symbol and allegory, and that the reason why allegory has overtopped symbolism is that the Fairy Queen and Pilgrim's Progress have been so important in England. Yeats relies on William Blake for the definition, but in fact, Yeats interprets Blake's definition of vision or imagination. William Blake has written, vision or imagination, meaning symbolism by these words, is a representation of what actually exists, really or unchangeably. Fable or allegory is formed by the daughters of memory. It is really interesting to see that Yeats equates imagination and symbolism. He seems to think that symbolism is as important as imagination, but that allegory is not. Coleridge thinks fancy is indeed no other than a mode of memory, emancipated from the order of time and space, while Blake and Yeats think allegory is formed by the daughters of memory. The terms fancy and allegory here have both been linked with memory. These literary terms, along with image and symbol, are keys to the understanding of how imagination works in a poem or other literary work. Yeats mentioned the term metaphor in the symbolism of poetry, and I find that he did not seem to fully realize that what he has tried to explain is in fact a metaphor, a metaphoric expression, that is, the indefinable symbolism he attempts to define is the working of metaphor. Here is what Yeats said. In symbolism in painting, I try to describe the element of symbolism that is in pictures and sculptures, described a little the symbolism poetry, but did not describe at all the continuous indefinable symbolism, which is the substance of all style. There are no lines with more melancholy beauty than these by Burns. The white moon is setting behind the white wave. Time is setting with me, oh. And these lines are perfectly symbolical. Take from them the whiteness of the moon and of the wave, whose relation to the setting of time is too subtle for the intellect. And you take from them their beauty. But when all are together, moon and wave and whiteness and the setting time and the last melancholy cry, they evoke an emotion which cannot be evoked by any other arrangement of colors and sounds and forms. We may call it the metaphorical writing, but it is better to call it symbolical writing, because metaphors are not profound enough to be moving when they are not symbols. It's a very interesting idea, right? And when they are symbols, they are the most perfect of all because the most subtle, outside the pure sound, and through them one can find out what symbols are. Yeats himself recognized it is metaphorical writing. I do find the analysis Yeats makes above is perfect, but what I would stress is that metaphor and symbol work a miracle. And the medium that links symbols and metaphors is imagination. Yeats calls the working imagination an emotion, but it is emotion evoked in the mind of the reader. The working of the metaphor here is so complex that refused to be put in any of the principles set up by John Searle as summarized below. But it could be classified as belonging to principle 1, 4, and 7, all at the same time. But the two lines by Burns are too subtle to analyze, and we just have to engage imagination to feel and be moved. Seamus Heaney dealt with imagination in 1990 Oxford lecture, Joy or Night? Last Things in the Poetry of Yeats and Philip Larkin. In the lecture, Heaney dissects the concept of imagination that was held by Yeats in his last years, with which Heaney sympathizes. Heaney says, writing near the end of his life, a general introduction for my work, Yeats told of his aspiration to a form of utterance in which imagination would be carried beyond feeling into the aboriginal eyes. Which eyes, needless to say, was the antithesis of the stuff to be found under the mortuary slabs. It represents not so much a frigid exhaustion as an ultimate attainment. It was an analog of that cold heaven where it seemed as though ice burned and was but the more ice. An analog also of Yeats' projection of the body hit of the pathetic and the subjective in art. For his embrace of the dramatic heroic, his determination to establish a crystalline standards of poetic imagination as a normative for the level at which people should live. For Yeats, there was something both enviable and exemplary about the enlargement of vision and the consequent histrionic equanimity which Yeats' heroes and heroines attain at the moment of their death, carried beyond feeling into the original eyes. This is a wonderful anatomy of the imagination realized in Yeats' later poetry. Yeats and Heaney are moderns while Shakespeare is an Elizabethan. No matter how similar in temperament, namely romantic temperament, they are two centuries apart. Their sensibility is different. Their imagination works very differently because they live in a different world picture. Today is more complex. Its complexity necessitates a new approach to poetry. Yeats proves that he is a big poet. Yeats has begun with the imagination of the pathetic and subjective as romantic, has gone through the dramatic and the heroic by way of the internal conflicts in Ireland against England, and through the creation and enlargement vision, and has arrived at the histrionic equanimity which is only possible in the culmination of Shakespeare's plays. And one of the supreme examples of this is realized in his poem, Beggar to Beggar. Beggar to the poem, time to put up the world and go somewhere and find my health again in the sea air. Beggar to beggar cried, being frenzy struck, and make my soul before my pate is bare, and get a comfortable wife and house to rid me of the devil in my shoes. Beggar to beggar cried, being frenzy struck. And the worst devil that is between my thighs, and though I'd marry with a comely lass, she may not be too calmly, let it pass. Beggar to beggar cried, being frenzy struck, but there is a devil in the looking glass. Nor should she be so too rich, because the rich are driven by wealth, as beggars by the itch. Beggar to beggar cried, being frenzy struck, and cannot have a humorous, happy speech. And there I'll grow respected at my age, and here amid the garden's nightly peace, beggar to beggar cried, being frenzy-struck, the wind-blown clamor of the barnacle keys. Isn't this a supreme realization of the imagination carried beyond feeling to the aboriginalized? Here is my analysis of how imagination works through modern metaphors in the poem. The structure of the poem is marvelous. It is the container that fits the mind of the beggar. Each stanza has 4 lines, rhymed A, B, A, B, and A. The flow of thought is always smoothed by the second line and collides with the third line, a cry that is directed to this violent reversal of the 2 steps of thought process. In the 2 lines that precede it, the beggar is in fire and ice. The beggar is in a state of being frenzy-struck, that is in fire. But he, in line 4, in each of the stanza, goes beyond feeling to the aboriginal state of ice and questions the validity of his desire and what he really wants to do, as cried in 2 lines. I cannot remove the metaphors from the poem without taking the subtlety of them, but the one metaphor that transforms itself in each context is the metaphor devil. The devil in to read of the devil in my shoes is the devil of Wanderlust, which is to be put to rest. The beggar is confused why he wants to get a comfortable wife and house. Is it because of the devil of the Wanderlust, or was it because of the devil that is between my thighs, namely the sexual desire? There's a violent weighing of the 2 kinds of devil, and they are balanced in tension. Partitioned off by the third line, cry of beggar to beggar cried, being frenzy-struck. The cry is symptomatic of modern sensibility. The beggar is speaking to himself, but it seems as if he is speaking to somebody else. Beggar is objectified, universalized, with a definite article, the, removed. It is an expression of a divided self, a schizophrenic self of modern mind. He is speaking his divided mind. In the 3rd stanza, the beggar's mind is muddled. Part of him wants a comely wife, part of him does not care, but the devil in the looking glass does care. The looking glass is both a mirror for the wife and the eye of the beggar that seeks some calmness in her. The next metaphor that evokes a strange feeling in the reader, the rich and the itch in relation to rich women and beggars. In the particular context, create a new metaphoric dimension. The rich and the poor are in fact poles apart. However, the rich and poor are so close that it is a new sensation. The rich wife is itched by the lights of richness, just as beggars by the lights of dirtiness. So, being rich is dirty and as itchy as being poor, and the new metaphor of the rich and the itch produces a strong emotion. In the last line, the place adverb there is a superb metaphor. It is a metaphor that refers not only to the happy home where husband and wife live together after marriage, but also to a life of wanderlust. At first glance, the stanza sounds affirmative to marriage. It looks as if the beggar is enjoying the happy married life, if there is read to mean at home. But the next wording does not allow such a reading, such an easy reading. I'll grow respected at my age. When the rich wife is itched, driven by the itch of being rich, those have no sense of humor, and if they cannot have humorous, happy speech, how could he grow respected? If this is the case, there is the street the beggar lives on. It is free, he is free, and as free as the barnacle is, that he hears over the head. The same lines can be read the other way. Also, the former beggar husband hears amid the garden's nightly peace the wind-blown clamor of barnacle gears. To read it more literally, he is at home in his room near the garden. Thus, he hears amid the garden. To go back to the more metaphoric reading, the beggar is still a beggar, crying to himself. his mind divided. The last stanza, in this case, testifies to the beggar's independence, which is both calm and heroic. What I have discussed is imagination in relation to metaphor. The modern sensibility seems to have outgrown its power and feels less satisfied with metaphor, feels a need to renovate itself, and the poet resorts to implied metaphor as is seen in the poem above. Okay, we'll take a 10-minute break. Thank you.